Good morning, everybody, and I do like to welcome you to this RTS special breakfast with Barb into understanding what people watch. And you've just heard my name is Nadine Dereza, but more importantly, my special guest today is Barb's Chief Executive, Justin Sampson. So a very warm welcome to you, Justin. Good getting to know you over the last couple of days. I'm really excited to be sharing some really interesting information on what we're watching, how we're doing it, what we're doing, and we're going to be finding out some really exciting information about SVOD in particular. But I don't know about you, some of my viewing habits have certainly changed over the last 2 to 3 years, whether it's binge watching Ricky Gervais's Afterlife, I don't know if anyone else does that, fabulous series, or actually watching Cobra Kai. Yes, that's my guilty pleasure. Don't tell anybody else. And I've recently discovered Stranger Things. My children say that I'm late to the party, but I absolutely love it. And both my children got up early last Friday to watch the 2 episodes. Yeah, people are nodding. They're dropped online at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I've never seen a 16-year-old put his alarm on for 7:45 on his GCSEs. Such was the power of Stranger Things. So are we interested to find out actually how the UK's viewing habits have changed? What are we watching? When are we watching? And how are we watching it? And it all points, doesn't it, to a lot of choice out there, consumed in different ways on different devices, which all needs to be measured and understood. And that is where Barb, the broadcaster's audience research board, comes in, delivering UK's audience ratings, the UK television's audience ratings. And they really are regarded as that gold standard measurement of what people watch, which is why I'm delighted that Justin is here today. And interestingly, you probably saw in the invitation when you signed up that last November, Barb began to actually report viewing of subscription video on demand, or SVOD, as it's known in the industry, and also video sharing services such as Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and YouTube. And this joins its existing reporting of pre-broadcast, live and post-broadcast up to 28 days. If that terminology is blinding with science, I know Justin will be able to take you through what it all means. I know some of you are very au fait with it. And we're talking about viewing on TV sets, tablets, PCs and smartphones. And since that development in November, that means we've got a more holistic, rounded, up-to-date picture of our viewing habits, which have emerged now, giving us great insights into how the landscape has changed and what impact that's having on what we watch. So this special RTS Breakfast with Barb event sees Justin's presentation in 3 chapters. And we've designed it that way so that rather than do a full presentation and wait for all the questions at the end, we've made it so much more interactive so you can hear from your good selves after each chapter. And we'll repeat that process for chapter 2 and 3. I'll ask a couple of questions, and I'll open to the floor for a couple of questions. Once we've finished all 3 chapters, right at the very end, if we haven't managed to cover off your other questions or some other general questions that you have, then time permitting, then yes, I can see you're a very friendly audience. We can have some more questions and comments coming from you as well. So that's the order of play. And in terms of what we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at surveying the landscape to begin with, so that's setting the context in how UK viewers are watching video on demand services. And the second key focus area will be on understanding people's choices. And then finally, we're going to lift the lid on the streamers and look at whether original new shows or old favourites like Friends, again, my daughter has been watching Friends back to back over the last couple of years. Are they more important in getting and retaining eyeballs? So that's kind of the order of play. And what I would say to you is that when you are asking questions, can you ask questions around the content that we're focusing on rather than deviating away from that particular section? So any more general questions we can do towards the end. So that's the format. Really looking forward to hearing from Justin. So Justin, it's over to you. Let's start by surveying the landscape and look at the uptake of SVOD services and how the audience levels compare to those broadcasters and video sharing services. And I think we should give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Nadine, I'm going to stand up for the bit when I'm sort of sharing the inside, and I'll sit down for the Q&A. So just stand up and sit down. Lovely to be here this morning to see so many, as Nadine says, friendly faces. What I wanted to do in this first section, in terms of surveying the landscape, as Nadine said, is just to look broadly at levels of subscriptions to the SVOD services, and that's something we've been measuring for many years. But as Nadine said, since November, we've been actually measuring time spent viewing and the number of people who are viewing SVOD and video sharing services. So first of all, let's start with looking at the number of homes that subscribe to an SVOD service. And we've been tracking this since the beginning of 2014. Now, unfortunately, on this chart, there are a few gaps. And this is because of the pandemic. During the pandemic, we weren't able to do some of our research as we wanted. But nevertheless, you can see since the beginning of 2014, for any SVOD service, and then for the individual services, you can see a general picture of growth. Let me pick out a couple of interesting things. So first of all, at the top, you've got just under 20 million homes subscribed to any SVOD service. So that's just over 2/3 of all UK homes. There's 28.5 million homes in the UK. As we, I think, expect, the biggest is Netflix, then Amazon Prime Video. The fastest growing is Disney+. So in the latest data we have, which is for Q1 2022, Disney+ put on an extra 1 million subscribers compared to Q4 2021. And we know that there were some high-profile launches in Q1 for Disney+. I'm thinking of, actually, Encanto was just at the end of Q4, but the Book of Boba Fett. We'll come back a bit later to see how Obi-Wan Kenobi is doing. But Disney+ is clearly seeing some quite significant growth in the number of homes subscribing. The other one I'd highlight here is Apple TV, which in Q1 for the first time exceeded 5% of homes subscribing. We know in Q1 that there was a lot of coverage of Apple's success, particularly the Oscars for the fabulous Coda, which I'm sure many of us have watched, which won Best Picture. And that could well be a reason why there's been a spike in Apple TV's subscription levels. One other thing before I talk about Netflix, I know that's the one that people are probably most interested in talking about, given recent coverage of its subscription levels. We see that 19.6 million subscribe to any SVOD service. What we can also see is how many subscribe to at least two. And there are 13.2 million homes that subscribe to at least two SVOD services. And that, again, is on the increase. So that was 13.2 million in the first quarter of this year, and that was up from 12.4 million in the previous quarter. So there is still evidence that people are adding SVOD subscriptions to their portfolio. There's no sign at the moment of people cutting the number of SVOD subscriptions they have. Let's look at Netflix, because I know since they announced their Q1 results, there's been a lot of speculation about is the subscriber growth over for Netflix. I'm going to zoom in on the Netflix numbers. And what I've done on this chart is I've added a dotted line. Now that dotted line takes the growth pre-pandemic and extends it to say, well, where would Netflix be if the pre-pandemic growth levels had continued? And the simple fact here is that the actual subscription levels are tracking well ahead of Netflix's pre-pandemic growth levels. And we can see that in Q1, according to our data, an extra 500,000 homes took on a Netflix subscription. I should say, by the way, our numbers here include paid for, trial, and also any subscriptions that people have as part of the value add they might get as part of the mobile phone package. But you can see that Netflix's subscriber levels are growing. They're well ahead of where they were, where you would expect them to be based on pre-pandemic trends. So I believe that the story of Netflix subscriptions being now in permanent decline is not the right story. I think there's still headroom for subscription growth. And we'll see in a couple of weeks to what extent I'm right or not. So that's a quick sort of a few headlines on numbers of subscribers. Let's turn to viewing data, and this is important. And I think it was in late 2019 that Reed Hastings first started talking about the importance of time spent viewing as a measure of Netflix's success, and not just the number of subscribers. We now have time spent viewing for video sharing and SVOD services. Now, what we've got here is our new definition of total viewing. We call it total identified viewing. And on the right here, we can see that this is for May, calendar month of May. On average, there's 224 minutes, so not far short of 4 hours a day, people watching either broadcaster services, SVOD, AVOD services, or video sharing services. You can see that broadcasters make up the majority, 148 minutes a day. SVOD, AVOD, just over half an hour a day. And video sharing platforms, 44 minutes a day. So that's the snapshot for May in terms of the time people spend viewing these different kinds of services. We can also see which screens people are using. And the simple message is that the big screen, the TV set, dominates for professionally produced long-form content. So total broadcaster viewing, 98% on the TV set. Netflix, 87%. At the other extreme, TikTok, 94% viewing is on the smartphone. I don't think any of us are surprised by that, but we now have clear, independently collected, hard evidence about this as a fact. YouTube, a bit more balanced. It does have a significant amount of viewing on the TV set. I think it's just over a quarter. But still, the smartphone is the most used device for watching YouTube. Some other early insights we're getting is that we know that SVOD services do better at weekends. So this shows the proportion of total viewing by broadcaster, video sharing, and SVOD, AVOD by day. And what you can see for SVOD, AVOD is each Saturday it grows. And on weekdays, SVOD as a share of all viewing declines a bit. So that backs up the narrative that the weekend is an opportunity to, what's the phrase, Netflix and chill, as I've been told. Not one I use often, but so there's clear evidence that the weekend is a time when people go to find content that they want to watch on SVOD services. And we'll see some more evidence of that later. But still, SVOD, AVOD never gets above 20% of all viewing. The eagle-eyed amongst you will see over here a peak for total broadcaster viewing on Christmas Day. Obviously a time of great shared viewing, and it seems to me that this reinforces that broadcaster services are still where people go to when it's shared viewing, and they don't want an argument about what to watch, is my instinct there. The other point I'd say here is that you might sort of discern a gradual decline in that total broadcaster line, so gradually trending down. Let me look into that in a bit more detail on this next chart. And this is to do with traditional seasonality that happens in viewing. So what we've got on this chart, first of all, the top line here is month by month total identified viewing minutes. So you can see in December, 265 minutes a day, dropping to 224 minutes in May. This is something we've grown to expect over many years. People in winter are more likely to spend time at home, they're more likely to spend time watching TV. Now, the next thing to point out here is you can see the proportion that is total broadcast is going down, but the proportion that's total video sharing is going up. Now, this doesn't reflect more viewing to total video sharing. In fact, it's fairly constant across the months. It's just that because there is less total identified viewing, video sharing is growing as a proportion. And what's coming out of this to me is that video sharing platforms seem less prone to seasonality than broadcasters and SVOD services. And I think that this sort of backs up the idea that when the weather gets better, people are out more, they're less likely to be at home, less likely to be in front of a big TV set looking for professionally produced long-form content. But if they are out and about, they can still snack on video sharing platforms. And just one last chart for this first chapter, again focusing on this idea of video sharing platforms and there being not as much seasonality there as there is for, as I think we all know, for TV, linear channels and SVOD services, is the importance of a very small group of YouTube viewers. So what we've done here is we've taken 10% of YouTube viewers and we've taken those 10% who spend the most time watching YouTube. And the headline is that 10% of YouTube viewers account for half of all of its viewing. 10% of YouTube viewers account for half of all its viewing. And you can see here on a month-by-month basis how many minutes a day they're watching. That's over 3 hours a day watching YouTube, this 10% of YouTube viewers. And you can see it actually grows a bit in April and May. So if you consider that this 10% of viewers accounts for half of YouTube viewing, and YouTube accounts for 3/4 of video sharing services, then these 10% of viewers alone are probably responsible for ensuring that there's no seasonality in video sharing viewing.
Fantastic. Just first of all, just in general, how accurate is the data? We talked about being the gold standard, and obviously trust is incredibly important. So how accurate is the data that you're presenting today?
Well, as you say, trust is absolutely paramount for Barb, and many years ago I heard a phrase which I sort of latched onto, which is trust arrives by foot and leaves by high-speed train. And so Barb has to spend a lot of time looking at the methods we use and testing them against real life, sort of noting studies to make sure that the data we're getting out of the homes is reflective of what's actually happening. And if we don't do things properly, then we know that trust will break down in our data. So we've had to take a considerable amount of time to make sure these data reflect what we believe to be really the case. Like any research, there's margin for error, but in everything we do, we look to reduce that margin of error to make sure that you can trust the data as much as you possibly can. And we're satisfied that the data that we're presenting is trustworthy.
Yeah, so independently is verified as well.
Independently, yes. So we've always been very reliant on techniques that don't need the active involvement of the media services we measure, although there are parts of what we do where some cooperation from the media services helps us do more. But in the case of Netflix and YouTube and Amazon Prime Video, we don't yet have their active involvement, so we're having to find ways to measure their audiences without their active support. So we could do a bit more if they were involved, but we're very happy with what we're doing so far. Yeah, in a way, they're missing a trick, aren't they, by not giving you that information, that data. Maybe one day they'll come on board as well, because obviously you're a not-for-profit organisation and you've got the big terrestrial players that form part of your organisation in terms of supporting you, don't they? Yeah, that's right. And I think for all these big online platforms, they've grown up reliant on the data they collect themselves, and they're getting very rich data pulled back from the devices that are used to watch their services. And they will often say that's all we need. But the points that I would make to them is, well, you're getting data from devices. We're telling you what people are doing. We're telling you how many people are in front of those devices, what type of people they are. And I'd also make a point, and I have made a point to them when speaking to them, you're only getting data for what people are watching when they're in your service. You're not seeing what they're watching when they're watching something else. And we know from our data, so take Netflix, for example, people who watch Netflix, according to our data, spend 85% of their TV set viewing time watching something other than Netflix. Now, if I were Netflix, I'd be interested to know what that is. But what is it they're choosing to watch when they're not within our platform.
Indeed, so still missing interest. I'm going to open up the floor in just a moment. Just interesting to find out about why it's taken maybe so long, because obviously SVOD has been out there for a long time, and this data is so rich and exciting. So we've got the whole landscape now. But why is it taking up until November to actually release this data?
So we're reliant on two techniques. One is that we have this sort of we have this panel of homes that represent the breadth of UK society, and what we've been installing in those homes is a meter which is attached to the Wi-Fi router, and that meter reads the URL information for the streaming services, and making sure that we're only picking up URLs which are actual viewing time is not as straightforward as it sounds. Because if, for example, again, using Netflix as a case, there's a range of Netflix URLs, a couple of which are very much focused on we are now streaming new content, but other URLs are used to send images to the EPG. And so what we've had to do is to just make sure we're picking up the right URLs and we're not picking up URLs which are not actual streaming data. It's not as straightforward as it sounds. I don't want to get too much into it. It's just not straightforward.
No, it doesn't sound so. It's quite complicated, so you need to get it right.
Yeah, but if we had their engagement and involvement, they could help us do that more quickly.
Right.
But we've had to do it without that.
Yes, but glad you have got round to doing it, because it's an exciting moment. So who has a question? So gentleman here has caught my eye. I'll come to you next.
Andrew Eagle, Octopus TV. Fascinating insight. A couple of things to pick up on. You talk about the panel of homes that you get this information from. Can you tell us how many homes and how you select the people? And secondly, Netflix, I think, will be coming to your door very soon when advertising obviously comes in, because they need to be able to sell it and get real figures which are verified. Internationally, Netflix don't seem to be doing as well as the picture that you've painted. How do you compare with other people? Do you share data and collaborate on that sort of basis as well?
So in terms of the panel, we are constant. Every week we interview 1,000 homes. And that's designed to do two things. One is to ensure that we understand the composition of the UK that our panel has to represent. And that also acts as a way of identifying homes that might become part of the panel. We're monitoring the balance of our panel day in, day out to make sure that we have targets for the number of homes of different types. But essentially, at the moment, there's 5,300 homes. We made a commitment last year to go to 7,000, which we expect to do by early 2024. That's the panel question. In terms of where other countries are in terms of getting this kind of data, we're only really alongside the US where Nielsen provides comparable data. We're the only two countries that have made progress in this space with independent measurement. So, yeah, we sort of share our insights with other countries, but the extent to which they prioritise this development over other things is a matter for them in their own country.
Yeah. I hope that's answered your question. It's interesting. I'm with you on the Netflix point of view, though, because it does seem like a business model in transition, but the UK is holding out for that international.
Well, their share price has suffered dramatically because of the negative press and their fallen subscription. And so I thought they would not want to change your model and make sure if you're telling everybody it's rising, it would have a very positive impact on their share price.
Yeah, that's probably for the UK, but obviously not.
And that's why I was about worldwide, so everybody else is saying a different story.
Interesting point. Any other thing you want to pick up on?
Well, the other thing was, I wasn't entirely clear how you select these 5,300 homes or whatever it is, the 1,000 you end up with. What's the process for people getting involved?
So we actively have interviewers out recruiting homes on an ongoing basis.
Right.
So across the course of a typical year, about 18% of our panel will what we call churn. Now, some of that is homes saying we don't want to do it anymore. A small part of that is us actually saying to homes, we need to take you off because we need to bring on a home of a different type to make sure the panel is balanced and represents UK society.
And do you have a sort of published list of what you're looking for? Is that available somewhere so people say, this is the cross-section, we've got so many people in this category, so many people in that?
We don't publish it on our website, but we have targets which are based on ONS census statistics. So to pick an example, we have, if you take homes of ethnic groups, we will have targets for the number of homes of Indian origin, Bangladeshi origin, and these are all related back to the ONS census.
I imagine that cross-generational demographic is incredibly important as well, particularly where we're consuming SVOD services. That typically is a younger demographic. I know we're going to come into some examples later. Great, thank you very much. Gentlemen here.
I've got two questions. The first is, did you have household individuals? I don't know how much household viewing takes place, and all the individuals now have got personal devices and everything. Is there an issue there? And the second one is people often have more than one device at the same time, so they might be watching, might be watching television whilst they're doing something else. Have you any metrics as to what extent people, if you like, are multitasking? If you added total hours up, I'm sure there must be some multitasking.
So taking your first question, we have a measurement that we call viewers per view, how many people are in front of the device. And you're absolutely right, when people are watching on tablets and smartphones and PCs, that viewers per view is only marginally above 1. So the TV set, the average viewers per view across all programmes is about 1.5. So we can identify shared viewing. There are particular shows where shared viewing is much higher. If you look at the Eurovision in May, I think the figure was around 1.8. Champions League was 1.9. So we've got lots of evidence which shows that particular types of programmes are very good at bringing households together. In terms of the question about whether people are watching different devices at the same time, technically we can identify that. We think it's very small. I think there's a question.
Yeah, is it based around this section? Yes, fantastic.
Well, so.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Universal. I just want to ask about, you're talking about that you interview very regularly the homes every week. Have you heard anything, has the narrative changed slightly with the cost of living crisis, and are people, there rumblings around people wanting to sort of cut their subscriptions, and is this the area in which they're looking to change their viewing habits?
Excellent question.
Well, I think that's something we're going to have to look at. So as I said, at the moment, the number of homes with more than one SVOD subscription is still on the increase. The data for Q2, which will come out in August, will give us some sense about whether that's a continuing trend or whether there is some evidence of that declining. So it's a bit early for us to be clear on whether that is playing out in practice. And there's lots of speculation about the cost of, clearly one of the effects of the cost of living crisis is that it becomes more expensive to go out. So people might spend more time in, and they might say, well, it's actually okay to keep an extra SVOD subscription at an extra £7 a month because I'm going out less often. So, and these are all the things we need to sort of look at and see as the year unfolds.
Yeah, indeed, there's quite a few economic headwinds coming our way, with a recession potentially around the corner. Let's hold fire now, if you don't mind. Excellent question, thank you very much. Let's now move on to our second section, and this is really about understanding people's choices. And in this chapter, I know you're going to talk about how audiences are watching broadcaster, BVOD, broadcast video on demand, and SVOD programming, with a particular focus on the different windowing strategies used. So yeah, looking forward to this.
So this is really about people choosing programmes and how they choose to watch them. Now, what I've got here first of all is this is the IPRESS file, which was on ITV earlier this year. And this is just a quick reminder of all the different types of viewing we can report on. So the IPRESS file was made available the whole season on ITV Hub at the same time that episode 1 featured in the linear schedule. So what we can see is how many, this is episode 6, the final episode, we can see how many people watched it before it was broadcast as part of the ITV linear schedule. That's 1 million. You can see 1.5 million watched live, and then 1.8 million watched in the 4 weeks after the broadcast. And you can also see the coloured ring on the outside shows on which device they watch. So you've got the TV set is very dominant in this particular example. So that's just a quick sort of taster for all the different things you can measure. Now, not all programmes are the same. And before I get on to SVOD shows, let's just look at another linear show and see how it stacks up on this basis, and that's Made in Chelsea. Now, this is episode 10 of the most recent series, which was available on All 4 for a week before it featured on the E4 linear schedule. And you can see, actually, most people who watched episode 10 watched it before it was broadcast as part of the linear schedule. And you can also see a much greater proportion were watching on smartphones, tablets, and PCs. Now, we can all speculate why that might be. Is it that Made in Chelsea is perhaps a guilty pleasure that people want to watch privately on a device on their own rather than on a big set with their family?
Yes, phone up, everybody.
I'm speculating. But nevertheless, I think you can start to see some interesting differences between how people choose to watch different programmes just when looking at the broadcaster VOD services. Now, as Nadine says, since November, we've been able to report audiences to shows that are on SVOD services. So let's look for May at the most watched VOD shows. Now, 2 in the 3 of the top 20 VOD shows are SVOD titles. So we start with Stranger Things, Senior Year, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Just to pick out a couple of points here. This is for view across the whole of the calendar month of May. Now, when you consider that Stranger Things and Obi-Wan Kenobi only became available on May the 27th, they're right up in the top 3, despite only being available for 4 days of the calendar month. So that's one thing I highlight initially. The next thing I highlight is number 5 is Encanto, which was made available for the first time on Christmas Eve. And it's the gift that keeps giving for Disney. It's consistently up there still in the most watched VOD shows. I won't go through all of these. The most watched BVOD show in May was Derry Girls, and then The Staircase with Colin Firth on Sky, and then D.I. Ray. And so that's the top 20 VOD shows. Now, taken on its own, this chart reinforces a popular narrative that SVOD is taking over. But let's now look at the top 20 shows in May, including linear viewing and linear playback. There are no SVOD shows in the top 20. D.I. Ray goes to the top, so it had 1.4 million on the previous chart in terms of viewing through the VOD service. It goes to the top when you include viewings to linear broadcast and linear playback. You've got Social Glue, Eurovision Song Contest, Britain's Got Talent, Platinum Jubilee celebrations. This doesn't include the actual weekend of the Platinum Jubilee, because that was early June, but there was a couple of programmes late May on ITV and BBC, and you can see those already starting to get big audiences. We know that for the actual Platinum Jubilee weekend in early June, on the Saturday evening, that programme got 13 million, which would clearly sort of be top of the chart. Another thing I'd point out is sport. So FA Cup final, which was in May, got 5 million. So while the SVOD services can be very pleased with some of the viewing numbers they're getting, I'm sure they'd be much more happy with these kind of numbers that are still being generated by the linear broadcasters. Let's look at some different windowing strategies. Now, we know that Netflix has championed for many years the whole series drop, and Nadine mentioned earlier Afterlife. I saw some nodding heads in the audience, so some of you are probably reflected in these numbers. And you can see that there's a... so what I've got on this chart, just to explain it, is on each day from January the 14th, which was the first day Netflix was available, we've got the average audience to each episode stacked on top of each other. Now, I need to sort of say that if somebody watched all 6 episodes, they will be counted more than once on that day. So on the first day, the teal bit at the top, which is episode 6, there are 300,000 people who watched episode 6 on the first day. So that's the first measure of how many people are binge viewing the whole season as soon as it's available. Another interesting measure is if you take all of the viewing across the first 28 days, 45% of it took place in the first 4 days. Now that's very high. That's an indication of how quickly people are getting through Afterlife. So that's a couple of indications of the binge viewing effect at work. Not all shows are the same. Let's look at Stranger Things. Now, the first thing to obviously say about Stranger Things is that this is Netflix experimenting with a different windowing strategy. It didn't make all 9 episodes available on May the 27th. As Nadine said, episodes 8 and 9 were held back until July 1st. Lots of speculation about why this might be. Actually, I'm grateful to Phil yesterday who mentioned something about the
Emmy Awards.
The Emmy Awards, and July 1st is when you get a new Emmy award season. So I don't know whether that's behind the window strategy here. Anyway, what we can see is, again, binge viewing in the early days, not as pronounced as the example we've just seen for Afterlife. So it's taking a little bit longer for people to get through to episode 7. So in the first 4 days, only 31% of the first 28-day audience watched in those first 4 days. So that's lower than the 45% we saw for Afterlife. So people are binging Stranger Things, but not as much as they're binging Afterlife. So that's an example on Stranger Things. There's lots of different windowing strategies. Let's look at a hybrid windowing strategy which is used by the BBC. So The Tourist was launched back in the beginning of the year on all episodes available on BBC iPlayer from January the 1st. The BBC showed episodes 1 and 2 on that first weekend of the new year, and then episodes 3 through 6 were stripped on the subsequent Sundays. And what you can see here is that actually there is quite a lot of the audience getting through all episodes on iPlayer in those early days. But there are some quite pronounced peaks for when the show appears as part of the linear schedule. And again, just to use that metric of what proportion of the 28-day audience was in the first 4 days, in the case of The Tourist, it was 38%. So actually more binging of The Tourist than Stranger Things, but less than Afterlife. Another interesting point here is if we overlay on here, on this day-by-day basis, the percentage of daily audience that watches through iPlayer, you can see that, first of all, as you would expect, on the days that it features as part of the linear schedule, the proportion that's watching through iPlayer goes down on these Sundays. The other point I make is that actually the percentage that watches through iPlayer never gets above 80%. So even those people who are watching linear playback are relying on digital recording devices. Not everybody watching episodes of The Tourist through on-demand sort of techniques are using iPlayer. They're still relying on a recording device.
Can I just ask a quick question? Does the iPlayer contain some sort of Barb tag?
Yes.
So that's a different measurement than listening.
It's a complementary technique that allows us to precisely identify when they're watching through iPlayer and through another source.
Yeah. Okay.
So digital recording devices are still widely used. iPlayer is successful, and this is true of all BVOD services, but there are still quite a lot of people who are reliant on digital recording devices that they may have had for many years. Not all programs are the same again. Here's another BBC example, which is conversations with friends. More recently, 12 episodes rather than the 6 that we saw for the tourist. That may encourage viewers to watch more over time, less evidence of binging up front. So actually, less than a quarter of the first 28-day viewing took place in those first 4 days. So there's less binging going on with conversation with friends. But if you look at the percentage viewing through iPlayer, that's much higher than we saw before. And to the point Nadine talked about earlier, we think the audience is younger. It's more of a streaming mindset audience. It's not as the actual numbers of viewers is less than tourists, so it is less mainstream. And it is people who tend to go to streaming services before relying on recording devices. One last example before we break for questions. Disney Plus, as I think we all know, they actually release series much like broadcasters always have, which is a new episode each week. This is Obi-Wan Kenobi. They made the first 2 episodes available on May 27th. It's been tremendously successful. It's been getting higher audience numbers than Stranger Things in absolute terms. And you can see here, so on May 31st, June 7th, the new episodes become available. And you can see there is a real kind of appetite for watching the latest episode on the first couple of days it's available. But there's lots of evidence here that people are quite happy to wait. I should have said also on the Stranger Things example, just to quickly go back to that, there's absolutely no evidence here of people not watching the first 7 episodes and waiting till episodes 8 and 9 are available, which is something people speculate about, and people might have thought, well, I'm not going to do the first 7, but you can see people need to watch things as soon as it's available. So there's a few little glimpses on some of the insight we're seeing on the programme. Let's stop and take some questions.
Yeah, indeed. So just going back to that lady in Chelsea, that's going to be the demographic driving that new behaviour. I know we said, are the audience secretly watching it? And it looks like a typical SVOD audience, doesn't it? When you compare that maybe with, for example, for ITV's Hit Press File, it's got to be the demographic driving that.
I think so, yeah. I think younger audiences we know are more tuned to going to streaming services first. Older audiences who maybe have had a digital recording device for many years have maybe not weaned themselves off that yet, and they still see that as more convenient than trying to find something on a streaming service. But yes, I think there is a mindset amongst younger people that they will go streaming service first before looking at what's on linear channels.
Yeah. Did you get the Hit Press File back there? Because we had pre-broadcast figures, I think you showed here on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just I've made a note of that actually. So for the Hit Press File, this is ITV, third of viewing was online pre-broadcast. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can answer this question, but is ITV able to monetise that pre-broadcast like they would do when they are actually live with it? Or are they just trying to pretend they're an SVOD player?
So if you look at total advertising income to the commercial broadcasters in 2021, I think it was just under £5.5 billion, and of that, 14% was to BVOD services. So that's £750 million being spent by advertisers on BVOD services. Now, I can't comment about how successfully ITV monetised this particular example, the Press File, but they are selling advertising around shows when they are being made available pre-broadcast, and you would have to sort of assume that they're getting part of that £750 million in advertising that's being spent each year on BVOD services.
And I think Phil and I had a chat yesterday. Does anybody know exactly what the Press File was all about? Answer on postcard, please. You watched it all? No. Yeah. So yeah, that was my concise. Okay, I've got a few other questions, but I'll hold fire for a moment because keen to get other people's points of views in. This lady here caught my eye. Hello there.
Hi, really simple question actually. The devices, are they being used in the home or are you monitoring them out of home as well?
So again, this is something where we can do more with the cooperation of the broadcaster. And the question about the tag, if we have a tag on the service, we can measure in and out of home. So in this particular case, this will include in and out of home viewing. But if we don't have the cooperation of the service, so it's the likes of Netflix, we're reliant on independent measurement, which we have to do in home. And I should also highlight that our measurement of viewing to programme audiences on SVOD is only on the TV set. So at the moment we can't, and again this would need the cooperation of the services like Netflix. We could measure their audiences on tablets and smartphones as well if we had their involvement. So I'm sorry it's not a straightforward answer, but again, it's a good example of how if we have the involvement of the services, we can measure more.
And I suppose they're not regulated, are they? Some of the services we're talking about. No. So that makes it more complicated. Great question, though. Gentleman there, hello there.
Hey, building on the question a bit earlier in that last session, so you mentioned iPlayer has Barb tech in the platform. Is that the same for some of the other larger BVODs, like O4 and ITV Hub? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So all of the broadcasters who are established participants in Barb have worked with us on that. We're also talking to other broadcasters about tagging their services. We haven't had any joy opening those conversations yet with the likes of Netflix and Amazon. But yes, all of the major broadcast VOD services have our tags in there.
Thank you. Any other questions? Gentleman there, hello there.
I'm just interested. Many years ago, we just had the Barb figures, so EastEnders might get 8 million, Tomorrow's World might get 2, and you sort of felt, yes, EastEnders was probably getting more, but I was never quite convinced it was actually 8.2 million, and that was extrapolated data. Now you can actually tag boxes. Are you finding there's a sort of validation between what you were extrapolating and what you can actually sort of know from checking the box information?
It's a great observation. So, as I said earlier, any research, you kind of have to have some element of extrapolating what the result would be. But because we have tags, we have not just the panel data, we have a census data set for all viewing to BVOD. And that gives absolute certainty, no margin for error on the volumes of viewing to the programme. And what we're doing now, without getting too research geeky about it, every day we integrate that census data with our panel data so that our results are a combination of the accuracy of the census data with the people insights we get from the panel. Because the census data, for all its lack of margin of error, it doesn't tell you who's in front of the device and who's watching. So we're using the strengths of the two sources to deliver as accurate data as we can, whilst also sort of making sure we can report who's viewing.
Did you still believe the 18 million figures that you said was got 20 years ago?
That's why I was working on Tomorrow's World at EastEnders, but I always thought it was more, I felt, yes, it's great, you know, you get these figures, but there might be an index rather than an absolute figure. That's how I sort of felt about it. I was very happy, yes, don't worry. But I was just interested, now we can actually cross-confirm whether there'd been, you know, when you look back, you think actually we were right. You know, that's great. We can now look back and think, yes, that was Morgan Wise did get 22 million.
Yeah.
Christmas Eve.
Validates your life. I'm going to take just a question from this lady here. Okay, yes, please. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, can you define exactly what you mean by linear when you talk about linear?
So this is people watching a broadcast schedule. So
as it's broadcast.
As it's broadcast.
Not counting iPlayer or any of them.
Yeah. So linear means how the service is delivered. And when I refer to linear playback, it's when somebody watches a programme that has been in a linear schedule in the last few days, and they're watching it a few days later. So this is the post-broadcast.
It was a traditional broadcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a linear terrestrial. Would you class it as that or something like that?
Well,
yeah.
It's terrestrial. It's satellite.
Right, yeah.
It's
as it happens.
As it happens.
It's services that offer a linear schedule as well as on-demand services.
Yeah. Yeah, the linear has come into the narrative in the last 2 to 3 years. When did you start referring to it as linear? How long ago? Go on,
Well, I guess we've started using the phrase more to distinguish between media services that are rooted in a linear schedule, but also offer the ability to watch that when you want, compared to services that don't have a linear schedule at all, so the likes of Netflix.
I think it's in really the last couple of years we started using that terminology more. So can I just hold fire, because we've got another section, because I'm very conscious of people's times as well. So any remaining questions, if you can hold fire. So we've got our third and final section. And really looking forward to sort of finding out really about the old programmes versus some of the new ones. Where are eyeballs going to? It's understanding, really, isn't it? The third and final chapter about lifting the lid on the streamers and looking at the contribution of those original new shows versus the old favourites, and how that's impacting those viewing levels for the major SVOD services.
Yeah, I've only got one chart in this section, but you have to bear with me. It's what I call my 100 Shades of Grey chart.
Try and decipher that.
Okay, so what I've done here, going back to December the 20th, each individual day, we've got the top 100 SVOD shows. We've taken their audience on each day and we've stacked them on top of each other. Now let me sort of add some colour to this to bring to life some of the really interesting things that are in this 100 Shades of Grey sound chart. So first of all, a little bit to the point I made earlier, you can see Christmas Day, big drop. SVOD shows not widely used on Christmas Day. There's pretty much a peak every Saturday and Sunday. So as I said earlier, they're a big day for going watching SVOD. One anomaly was Easter weekend, where actually the peak came on Easter Monday rather than Saturday and Sunday, which we haven't quite managed to explain to ourselves yet, but there's something for you to think about. But the really interesting thing here is how the SVOD services are reliant on a combination of new and established content. And when ITV a months ago announced the pending launch of ITVX, they used an analogy which I really liked, which was they talked about fireworks and bonfires. You need to have bright shows that explode into the schedule and create audiences, whilst we need to also have regular content that people keep coming back for. This is something that broadcasters have relied on for many, many years. And guess what? The SVOD services rely on it as well. So first of all, here I'm picking out some originals that in this period. So Cobra Kai, your favourite, that exploded over Christmas. There you've got Afterlife coming into play. You've got Reacher on Amazon. You've got Bridgerton in March. Stranger Things comes into play here. I've put Encanto on because Encanto is kind of a bit of an anomaly because it just keeps on giving and keeps. So that's an example of how originals kind of explode into life and they sort of take up quite a big part of the year. But along the bottom, and this is the last part of the presentation, 5 shows. Big Bang Theory, Friends, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Simpsons, and The Office. Those 5 shows, when you look at the audience for these 100 shows, those 5 shows account for 21% of all the viewing. If we took all 5,200 SVOD shows that we've been measuring and look at the whole audience to those 5,200 shows, these 5 shows account for 11% of viewing. So for the SVOD services, it's the new stuff that gets a lot of the headlines. But without these 5 ongoing services, their viewing would decline quite dramatically. So the thing that, for me out of this is, to what extent are SVOD services really that different to broadcast services in terms of their reliance on a combination of established and new content? Let me stop there.
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
I hope that chart is illuminating.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's what SVOD, are they really different from the way, like you said, traditional broadcasters operate when it comes to original new shows and old favourites? And that data, you can't really argue with, can you? 11% of all SVOD viewing coming from 5 of those key series. And I suppose, obviously our tastes change, and Friends still stands the test of time, doesn't it? And probably look to the
it's getting a whole new generation of viewers. So children of the original Friends viewers are now finding it, and maybe even grandchildren.
Yeah. Right, I've asked a few questions already, so who would else like to ask a question now? The gentleman here at the back. Hello there.
Hi there. I was just wondering, when you refer to Christmas Day, there's a drop-off from the SVOD services into linear. Is that fairly proportionate in terms of the fallback into all linear channels, or is it just the big 5 or 6 linear channels that benefit from that drop-off?
I have to say that I haven't done that analysis in forensic detail, but when you look at the most watched shows on Christmas Day, they do tend to be on the bigger channels. It's the things that people get together for. The Queen's speech still gets quite big numbers, not as big as it used to get. What was the big movie on ITV last Christmas Day? Yes, there's a big movie. So
someone help out. Who watched the big movie, ITV, last Christmas? It's
Don't look up.
That's SVOD.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's SVOD. Don't look up quite well. So I'm afraid I haven't done that forensically, but it does.
I'm just wondering whether the smaller channels like Babe or something would see a significant pickup as part of the waterfall decrease from the SVOD.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't looked at that, but in terms of the most watched programmes, they do tend to be on the what you might call bigger established places.
Thank you.
I'll go to that lady first, I'll come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Just interested if you could circle back a little more when you talked about the integration of your census data and the panel data, and that allowing you to have an absolute measure of the broadcasters, BVOD services. Can you talk a little bit more about the census data, if you don't mind, just to try and understand how exactly that is measured? Is that where you're reliant on the broadcasters tagging?
Absolutely. So there's to use the technical phrase, there's an SDK. You know that? The broadcasters embed that in the BVOD player, All 4, ITV Hub, etc. And that SDK fires off tags which are captured by our research agency whenever anybody, not just people on our panel, but anybody watches those services. So if any of you are watching those services, we're collecting your viewing data. We don't know it's you. We just know which device has fired that has been used to watch the content. And those tags enable us to know which programme was watched, for how long it was watched to the second, which device it was on. To the earlier question, we can get that out of home, not just in home. And that creates this census data set, which is tremendously rich and tremendously accurate.
Is that forgive me for just asking a follow-on question, is that captured in the gold standard report, or is that a slightly different report?
So what we then do, having collected our census data, we have a data integration contract where, and Kansar does this for us, they, to use non-technical language, they find a way of stitching together the census data and panel data. So the census data is improved by the observations we got from our panel about which types of people are watching on devices. So we can add demographic information to that census data, while the census data, to the earlier question, provides greater certainty on the volumes of viewing. So there's a data integration method which, if you're really, really interested, we can arrange a whole session for you on that.
Lucky you, a personal one-to-one session.
I just have one very tiny question linked to it. The SDKs, are they sophisticated enough, for example, with ITV Hub, where they now have VOC, where that was previously available on All 4? Is it sophisticated enough to be able to tell you that that data is being watched by ITV Hub as opposed to All 4?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, lady here, and I'll come to you afterwards. Hello there.
Sorry, just going back on Afterlife and the 45% in the first few days.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a lot to be said around about duration of the programme? So that's a half hour versus Stranger Things is an hour. The shows here are all half hour comedies, the 5 shows here. Do you think that the fact that comedy can be binged so quickly, without commitment, think that plays into this slightly?
Yes. Yeah.
I think there's probably a lot of truth in that. Yes. And you're right. Stranger Things sort of tends to be longer episodes. I know they're not all the same length, but they're kind of, I think, 40 to 60 minutes.
Well, 8 and 9, well, they were in there for about 4 hours, I think. They were feature length, yeah.
Not far then. But,
Yeah.
so I think there's something to that, definitely. But I think there's also a bit of a mindset thing. I think, as I said, with conversations with friends, when there's 12 episodes, you think, actually, I'm not really going to get through this in 2 or 3 days, so I'll sort of stagger it out, I'll stretch it over a longer period of time. I think, what we're seeing is that there's no one form of behaviour in all circumstances. And what we're delighted to be able to do now is to sort of start bringing to life examples of where there are differences. And that those differences will depend upon the length of the programme, the nature of the programme, to what extent they're mass market audiences or maybe more niche. And the lovely thing is we can all draw our own conclusions and inferences from independently collected data, and that's what we're delighted to bring now.
Yeah, good observation. Lady here, hello there.
I'm Karen in Networks. So just going back to the census and the tagging versus people data, is it sophisticated enough is it triggered when someone downloads a piece of content but doesn't necessarily watch it? Or do they actually have to actively watch it and stream it?
So if somebody downloads a bit of content to watch on the move, and they then watch it, then the next time they are on a Wi-Fi network, those tags will be fired to say that bit of content was watched.
Okay, so it's watched, not just necessarily. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's something I think we struggle with Sky set-top box data is sometimes a series will get automatically downloaded the next episode, but someone doesn't necessarily want to watch it. So
so we have got that ability to say it was actually watched.
That's reassuring in many ways, isn't it? Yeah. Lady there, hello there.
Hi there.
Hi.
This might be overly simplistic, but could we then assume that Barb has progressed or will progress to a point at which we can rely on it for on-demand figures as opposed to actuals released by, broadcasters in their annual reports, for example? Would those two figures match up?
Well, in terms of the data we produce, the broadcasters are very reliant on our data for their annual reports. So if they're reporting our data, then it should be exactly the same as if you were to do the data yourself, get the data yourself, get the same number.
Do you mean on the SVOD side, though? You're talking about the Netflix and the Amazon?
BVOD side, so,
on BVOD, okay.
Hub Plus, etc. I suppose if you compare sort of Q1 figures for ITV Hub versus, Barb figures versus what they published in their quarterly report, for example, there is a difference between the figures.
Sure.
I guess just trying to understand that.
Well, that gap should narrow to the point of extinction, because one of the reasons we've been doing this is the broadcasters and saying we need you as Barb to be able to provide more precision on what part of our audience is actually ITV Hub. Now, I mentioned earlier that the meters we've attached to the Wi-Fi routers in panel homes, not only has that helped us get aggregate level viewing to the non-participating SVOD, but it's also given us the ability to be more precise, particularly when somebody's watching a show that's been in a linear schedule in the last few days. We can say, well, did they watch it because they played it back to a recording device, or did they actually watch it through the streaming service? So we're now providing more accurate data on whether that linear playback is through ITV Hub, to use your example, or through a recording device. So the broadcasters now have richer data about exactly how much of their viewing is through the streaming service. So I would hope in time that gap will vanish.
And finally, Justin, what was on the wish list for you to make it, your job easier? I know we talked about the streamers like Netflix, Amazon coming on board, because actually both would benefit. It would be useful then for them to find out what's going on when people aren't watching their services to get a whole more complete picture. But what's on your wish list?
I mean, it would be great to have more involvement from the streamers who are at the moment sort of a bit arm's length to us. Realistically, though, I think even if Netflix and YouTube were to come on board, the ability for us to sort of independently tag their services is something that I think is not going to happen. So we, as Barb, have said we need to be more open to working with the data that are collected by the services we measure. And philosophically, that's quite a shift for us. We've always taken the view that we only independently work with data we've independently specified and collected. But we are actually open to working with what we call the media owner's first-party data. That's a big priority for us. We'd love to get involved with the likes of Netflix and YouTube to do that. That's on our to-do list. It's not a straightforward conversation. A lot of these companies, as we know, are American, and they are looking to do things in a way that's consistent across all markets. And while the UK is an important market, the UK is, as far as the Americans are concerned, part of Europe, and we're a bit further ahead in terms of what we're doing in the UK than our counterparts on continental Europe. So some of our conversations with the likes of Amazon and Netflix sort of go a bit slow when they say, well, if we can't do this across the whole of Europe, do we just do it in the UK? So that can be a bit frustrating. But it'd be lovely if we could get more engagement from the likes of Netflix and Amazon. We've got open conversations. Are they going as quickly as I'd like? No, but they're not dead. So that's
interesting.
But
yeah.
Could I just add one thing? Do you think with their move to having ad-funded services, actually that conversation moved quicker because they want an absolute measurement for their advertising?
I would hope so, but we need advertisers and agencies to make that point to those platforms. Because advertisers and agencies, and we've got a situation like this already in the UK, because with Amazon's Premier League coverage, they sell adverts around that.
Okay.
We're now producing independent data on the audiences to that. We really need the advertisers and the agencies to be saying to Amazon, we want to trade with you on Barb data. So we can do whatever we can to provide the measurement, but you need the advertisers and agencies to be saying to these platforms, we need you to be independently measured.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. So I'm just conscious of time because some people have other meetings and things to go to. I found it absolutely fascinating this morning, understanding what we're watching, and also how exciting it is that now SVOD services are included in the data. There's so much more in our understanding, hopefully, that you'll be able to undertake as Barb over the coming months and years of difficult conversations maybe to have. So SVOD services look like they're taking over, but when you include linear, a very different picture emerges, although the trend is sort of chipping away, isn't it? And we can see SVOD playing a bigger part as the demographic grows older who are used to consuming SVOD on a regular basis. Yeah. So if what's the likes of me is out of the way, and the millennials and the younger generations come through, I think SVOD will play an even bigger part. Yeah, interesting.
I think that's right. And one thing I wouldn't underestimate is the power of life stage.
Yeah.
And how that influences behaviour as well. We haven't really talked about this, but when millennials have kids, their behaviour will change.
Yeah, indeed.
I'll just say that.
Can you join me in thanking Justin Sampson? And can I just thank you, the audience, as well? Some excellent questions we've had today. Thank you very much. I hope you found it useful and enjoyable. Appreciate you spending your morning with us.